Hello, everyone. My name is Kathy Macbeth, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing at EcoEngineers, and welcome to the presentation of our LCFS Verification-Ready webinar. During this webinar, our speakers will provide a comprehensive overview of the recently approved LCFS program updates with specific emphasis on the verification requirements. EcoEngineers is a renewable energy consulting firm specializing in clean energy regulations. Our core services include audit, compliance management, and consulting services, and we serve biofuel producers across all fuel types domestically and internationally. We hold subject matter expertise under the RFS and LCFS program, and our demonstrated performance includes having over 2.6 billion gallons of biofuel capacity under management, over 60 producers enrolled in our RIN compliance program, being one of the first U.S. EPA recognized QAP providers under the RFS, completing over 160 biofuel plant audits in 20 countries, registering over 90 LCFS pathways, and transacting over 3.1 billion RINs across our proprietary RIN management platform. Now let me introduce our presenters, Mr. John Sens and Ms. Natasha Beilstein. Mr. John Sens is a senior regulatory consultant and LCFS program expert at EcoEngineers. John assists biofuel producers participating in the LCFS program and has registered over 90 pathways. He routinely interacts with CARB staff, attends industry conferences and government hearings on current interpretation of rules, regulations, and market trends. Mr. Sens holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies with Natural Resource emphasis and a Master's in Music Performance at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Ms. Natasha Beilstein is a regulatory consultant at EcoEngineers, responsible for assisting clients with regulatory compliance issues related to the LCFS. She contributes detailed research and develops sound compliance strategies for biofuel producers and municipalities participating in the LCFS program. Ms. Beilstein researches industry regulations, attends industry conferences, and maintains deep knowledge of LCFS market trends. Ms. Beilstein holds a BS in Community and Regional Development with a minor in Environmental Policy Analysis and Planning from the University of California, Davis. With that, Natasha, take it away.
Thank you, Kathy. Before we jump into everything, let's take care of a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be answering questions throughout the webinar as we finish the topics and intermittently throughout. Please submit those via the GoToMeeting chat tool. If you have any questions that are not covered in the presentation, send those as well, and we will try and answer them at the end. And if you have any other questions that don't get answered, be sure to email them to Kathy. We'll provide her email to you at the end, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Please note that you can send questions both privately and publicly. We'll be fielding questions from both. We have a little example right here that shows that you can send it to everyone or just the presenter only, and those questions will just show up to us. These slides will not be sent to participants, but fingers crossed the recording goes well and we can make that available, and if it doesn't, we'll be sure to have this, we'll be able to do this webinar once again. Let's get into it. So this is why we're here today, this huge passing of the LCFS regulation. We're going to be getting into some big changes that have occurred with the addition of verification and the transition to utilizing GREET 3.0. We'll be focusing on four main topics: the overview of the LCFS verification requirements, transition to California GREET 3.0, the need to be LCFS verification ready, and other LCFS updates we think matter and are important to shed some light on. Passing this regulation has been significant, and it made substantial updates, but largely it was a signal to the market that the sixth largest economy in the world committed to lowering GHG emissions by 20% by 2030, that renewables are the future of the market. On September 27th, CARB passed the latest iteration of the regulation that underwent copious public comment and review to reach a version that was passed by CARB. The full link is provided right here, and I recommend you check it out. Find the parts that relate to you and your operation and your function within this regulation. Coming soon, CARB is going to be hosting a workshop on the implementation of the regulation on November 16th. The link here will provide you with more information and more details on how to log in, how to be a part of that workshop. John, do you mind taking a couple minutes here and going through the annual compliance schedule?
Absolutely. So on the right side of the slide, you can see the annual compliance schedule that has been illustrated for the schedule from 2011 all the way through 2030. So you can see on the left side, before this legislation, that the program was kind of bumpy. That's because of a number of different factors and some litigation that took place. Starting in the middle there, you can see the creation of the gray line, which is the jet fuel substitute schedule, which is new. And throughout the schedule, you can see the gasoline annual schedule as well as the diesel annual schedule. CARB has done a lot of work to really try and stabilize the program going forward to 2030 and make it very predictable and hopefully give the market a clear path forward. So starting in 2019, there's a 1.25% reduction each year until ultimately we reach that 20% greenhouse gas reduction for transportation fuels by 2030. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Natasha.
Thanks, John. So let's take a couple minutes here and answer some of the questions that we've had come in. So what happened to 20% reductions by 2020? John, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, it looks like they're asking about a 10% reduction by 2020, and ultimately CARB is moving to actually have like an 8% reduction by 2020 rather than meet that 10% reduction. It's about there. And by the end of the period, they're shooting for 20% total. So their real focus here was trying to straighten out the compliance schedule for the program and give a lot of clarity about where things are going so that companies can invest and build and develop by that. You see another comment here that the workshop has been moved to the 28th. I think that's something we'll go ahead and verify after this as well, but you can check the CARB website under the workshops tab and underneath the workshop site. Go ahead and double check that date there. Whether it's the 16th or the 28th, we really recommend that you attend that and watch that to make sure you're up to date, because they're going to talk a lot about how they're planning to implement the program, which is really, really important as we move into the program.
Yes, very true. Thank you, John. Let's move into GREET 3.0. So GREET 3.0 is here. Why is it important to you? For one, GREET 3.0 will be replacing the GREET 2.0 pathways that become deactivated during Q1 of 2021. Additionally, in the work we've done in the model, we've been seeing a reduction of 2 to 3 CI points for biodiesel and 3 to 5 CI points for ethanol. There's a market advantage for those who update to 3.0 sooner because they'll be selling fuel with a lower CI versus those with the 2.0 CI score. Notably, we have Dr. Zhao Wang on staff working through these models with clients, and we're going to be ready to submit those in January 2019 as soon as the application portal opens by CARB, and we're really excited to get working on those. As an important part of your application, you'll have to identify which category you fall into. We have 3 different categories. This will help you identify the amount of application data you need and the compliance measures you'll have to make sure you're in compliance with. First, we have the lookup tables. These are values that have been preset and approved by CARB, and they'll have a faster approval time by CARB. So you can start generating your LCFS credits sooner. We have the Tier 1 pathways, which will be utilizing the new Tier 1 calculator, which we'll go into in the next slide, for biodiesel, renewable diesel, LNG, CNG, ethanol from starch, fiber, sugarcane, biomethane from landfills, anaerobic digestion of wastewater, organic waste in dairy and swine manure. This is the most common place you'll find a lot of your pathways, and you'll be able to use that new calculator. For Tier 2, this will be used for the more innovative or complicated fuel types or processes. This will allow you to have more inputs and give you a better CI score that can best reflect your process. All right, so here's the summary table for the new simplified CI calculator. We've used the starch and fiber ethanol as an example here. So you'll have inputs that you can put in, and we want to make sure that you are very, very aware that these values have to be correct, and they have to have supporting data behind each of the values. We also want to ensure that you are using the correct units when you are putting your information into here. We're available to help. We have a great modeler on staff who's really excited to start answering these questions for you. All right, John, well, I'm going to pass it off to you on why to transition to GREET 3.0.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I talk through this slide, we have gotten a couple questions I think bear addressing. So first up, why is the CI lower with the GREET 3.0 model? And that's a great question. So I'm going to take a second and explain that. So the GREET 2.0 model that exists now was based off of the Argonne National Laboratory's 2013 GREET model, where the GREET 3.0 model is based off of Argonne's 2016 model. And so that 3-year difference in data is what's driving that change in carbon intensity. So things like the electricity grid have gotten greener over time as more renewables have come online and more natural gas is being used to produce energy. And also some other changes were made to farming practices, to chemical use and other factors. A lot of things have just been updated in the course of creating the California GREET 3.0 model. So that's what's driving the difference in the CI score.
John, I'm seeing another question here. Must a CARBOB producer use the lookup tables for the CI?
Right, that's a good question as well. Generally, for reporting for CARBOB, you do need to use that lookup table value. However, if you have a refinery that has an innovative practice, or you have applied for the low complexity or low energy use provisions, I would encourage you to review those provisions that are in there in the regulation that will give a producer the ability to use a different value for CARBOB based on one of those innovative programs. Because there are some options that are in there that have been continued and expanded in the new regulation. Great, well, thanks for the questions. Keep those coming. I'm going to go ahead and talk through why we think you should transition to 3.0 based on that difference in value. So this slide shows 2 different examples that exist to demonstrate the benefits of that different value. So on the first line here, we have the ethanol in value per gallon listed out per line. So this is an example of a facility that right now has a CI of 73, and under the 3.0 application, it'll have a CI of 70. So with that 3-point difference, that has a big impact on the per gallon value, which is also dependent on the LCFS credit value. So when the LCFS credit value is at $100 per credit, you're looking at about 2 or 2.5 cents per gallon of ethanol benefit on top of what you're getting currently. At $150, it's close to 4 cents per gallon, and at $200, it's just about 5 cents per gallon of difference. And this is just from moving from the 2.0 to the 3.0 model because of those differences that I talked about. Another example would be for a biodiesel pathway that's currently at a 27. So if it moves down 2 points to a 25, you could see a benefit of anywhere from 2.5 cents for $100 LCFS credits, almost 4 cents at $150 LCFS credits, and at $200 per credit, you could see about a nickel per gallon of biodiesel in additional benefit for making the same sales and with the same production process because of the difference in the model. Now, I will say this is going to be still facility specific and fuel specific, so you'll need to understand and investigate how much of this difference will apply to you. But we're confident that, especially for ethanol and biodiesel, that there's some real gains to be made from transferring to the GREET 3.0 model. So coming up, I'm going to go ahead and walk through some timelines to demonstrate that transition from the 2.0 model to the GREET 3.0. And this is going to be different based on whatever your approach to the market is. So for this initial scenario, if you choose to wait to apply for the GREET 3.0 and you currently have a 2.0 pathway, this is kind of the scenario we would see. So at the top line there, we have your existing GREET 2.0 application, which, that pathway will be good through the end of 2020, at which point it will be deactivated. Once it's deactivated, it won't be able to be used anymore. So you need to prepare your California GREET 3.0 pathway so that you have that in 2021 and beyond. So for that 3.0 pathway, we recommend preparing that in the beginning of 2020 and submitting that and shooting for approval no later than the second half of 2020. Because the worst thing that could happen would be that your 2.0 pathway expires and you don't have a 3.0 pathway to use for reporting. Because that would put you in kind of a catch-22 situation and could really disrupt your operations. As part of the program moving forward, you're going to need a monitoring plan. I do have some more details about that later on to talk through. We recommend preparing that monitoring plan in 2019, even if you're planning to apply in 2020, because you will need the monitoring plan for verification in 2020 for your 2.0 pathway and for the 3.0 validation and verification. So with that in mind, you will need to find a verification body for 2020 and forward to verify your 2.0 pathway and validate and verify your 3.0 pathway. And I will explain the difference more between validation and verification a little bit later on. So for those of you planning to apply for the 3.0 pathway now, we would see, this is kind of the scenario for you. So you have that 2.0 pathway, and again, that's going to expire at the end of 2020. And we would recommend that you just begin preparing for that 3.0 application now. That way you can apply as soon as possible in 2019 and hopefully start realizing that value sooner. If you are planning to apply now, you should also begin preparing your monitoring plan now, so that way you are ready to go for validation in 2019. CARB is going to be the body that's going to actually do the validation in 2019, so you need to be prepared for that and have that monitoring plan in place when you submit that 3.0 application. Because this is a new program and a new transition, I think there will be some back and forth and guidance from CARB, but ultimately you should do your best to be prepared for that with a monitoring plan and collecting all the information related to that going into 2019. And for the last piece, you will need a verification body to complete your annual and ongoing verification in 2020 and moving forward for your compliance as well.
So John, I'm seeing something here about CARB validation. What exactly does that mean for producers? Does that mean that they're going to be coming onto facilities? What are they going to be doing to validate these CI scores?
That's a good question. So throughout the regulation, it's specified that the initial validation is verifying what the CI score is for the application, as well as the data sources for the application. Also with validation, there's an initial site visit component. Now, from my read on the regulation, it's not clear whether CARB is planning to do an initial site visit, but that's something that you should prepare for. And that's another reason to tune into their webinar when they have it, because you can get the, how exactly they're planning to do the validation in 2019. Because this is only an introductory sort of period where they're phasing the market in, because ultimately the third-party verification bodies are going to do the validation. This is really just to help the market transition, so they may have some special terms for that initial validation.
Great, thank you, John.
All right, well, let's go forward to the last timeline here. For any of you participating in this that don't have any pathway, the steps for you to get a pathway are going to look pretty similar. So you're going to, again, need to get your 3.0 application, and we'd recommend preparing for that in the beginning of, well, like right now, so you can submit in the beginning of 2019. You're also going to need that monitoring plan, and we'd also recommend preparing that now, so that way you have it when you're moving forward. CARB will also perform your validation on the new 3.0 pathway, and you will also need to get a verification body to complete those services for you moving forward.
All right, John, this seems like a hot topic. We have a lot of questions coming in about this. So let's start with, won't the first verification include data for 2019 and 2020? Yes,
the answer is yes. So the first compliance year is going to be 2020, and that report is going to be submitted in 2021, which is actually illustrated on the timeline on the top right side there. that report will include data from 2019. However, the actual verification report for that is not going to happen in 2019. You don't need to do the ongoing verification until you are in 2020 being verified by that third-party verifier.
All right, another question I'm seeing is, do we expect to see CI gains for renewable diesel with GREET 3.0?
I believe the gains would be similar to biodiesel, but that's something we'd need to check. If you want to follow up with us, we can give you an idea on that. But I know for ethanol and biodiesel that's locked in. But again, it's something that we need to check on a fuel type basis.
And a lot of these are facility by facility specific, right?
Right, they can be. But as far as just the change in the model, that's something that we could look into.
Yeah. All right, and then let's take one last question. Do you need California GREET 2.0 approval for a provisional CI score for manure?
So if you're looking for a 3.0 pathway, you don't need to have a 2.0 pathway first. And that's part of what we made this slide, is that if you have a new facility that's being constructed, you just need to apply for a 3.0. You don't have to have a 2.0. What you do need, though, is 3 months of data, of operational data, to submit for the provisional application, because CARB is maintaining the provisional versus full pathway approach. So the minimum you need is 3 months of data to submit an application for a 3.0 pathway going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Let's keep going on, and we'll get to some of these questions afterwards.
Okay. So we're going to take a look more at the actual verification program overview and talk a little bit more about those details, and hopefully that will help on the on some of the questions we're seeing here. So please do keep the questions coming, though. This is great. So like I said, the LCFS verification is going into effect on January 1, 2019. This is going to be mandatory for all the renewable fuel producers and for regulated parties. Now, the amount of reporting and verification you need to do does depend on your role in the industry and how you are participating. So there's some different categories based on which programs you're a part of. But in general, the renewable fuel producers, are going to have all the components I described here with the site visit and CI verification and so on. And I do have some more details about that coming up. So as I've said, verification bodies will complete validation and verification starting in 2020. CARB will be the one completing the initial validation in 2019. The first compliance year is 2020, but as I said as well, that initial compliance year will include data from 2019 because it's a 2-year review for the CI score. That first report is going to be due in August of 2021. So I mentioned the monitoring plan in that chart, and this is a little bit more detail on that. So the monitoring plan is the overall plan and blueprint basically for how the facility operates, and this is what gets used by the verifier and validator to complete the work for the facility. So every entity is responsible for obtaining validation and verification and retaining that monitoring plan. So if you're going to go through verification, you need a monitoring plan. So overall, that includes the general overview of the facility and the boundaries. So where is it located, what's going on inside of it, the methods, the processes, the methodologies used to collect the data and record the data. So all the systems that are used for that and accessing that data as well. The sources of data and related diagrams like the process flow diagram, block flow diagram, identification of measurement devices. So which data points are coming from which devices, what are the numbers for those devices as well, calibration for those meters and devices, and more. Just listed the short list of some of the big items here. But the idea is that with this comprehensive plan, the verifier can come to you, look at your plan, and put together how they're going to verify you and approve your pathway going forward. So our recommendation is to get that in place when you're applying for your 3.0 pathway. The drop dead date for that is going to be in 2020 because that's going to be the first year where you're going to be underneath that in that compliance where the report's going to be completed for that time period.
Hey, John, I'm seeing a question here. Is the monitoring plan similar to the engineering report that needs to be submitted for a RIN pathway application?
That's a great question. So The monitoring plan is going to be similar, but I'm going to say it's like another step down in complexity, because the engineering review covers a lot of what's going on at the facility and a description of the process, which a lot of detail will overlap, but there will be additional detail and requirements beyond that that should be taken into consideration when putting that there.
All right, one more question. Are refineries not producing renewable fuels required to have a monitoring plan?
That's also a really good question. My understanding would be that they may need to have a monitoring plan. I know that refineries will need through verification for quarterly reports and verifying that information. So as part of that, you may need to collect data and have a plan how you're collecting data that gets reported. That's something that we could look into more closely as well.
All right.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions, so we're just kind of looking at those. So go ahead and pick another one, Natasha.
Okay, so one question I'm seeing here, I think you all might be able to see this one. So if you have a Tier 1 pathway approved using the updated calculator, for example, biomethane from dairy waste, do you need to run the larger GREE 3.0 model to finalize the CI score?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Tier 1 pathway is going to be calculated using the calculator. So you do not need to run the GREE 3.0 model for the CI score. But if your facility and pathway and what you're doing doesn't work in the Tier 1 calculator, like you've got inputs or outputs that don't match that, that's where you may need to do the Tier 2 pathway, and then that's when you would need to run the larger GREE 3.0 model. So it's going to be facility and operation specific, and that's something that we look at a lot is where you're going to fall. But overall, CARB really has tried to simplify and synthesize down each of those things listed in that table so that you can use the Tier 1 calculator.
All right, John, those are all the questions I'm seeing for right now. If you want to move on to some verification requirements.
Okay, sounds great. So this slide kind of explains a little bit about the validation versus verification. At a high level, CARB has split up the initial approval versus the ongoing compliance into validation and verification. So if you read through the regulation, you're going to see that a lot where it says validation or verification or vice versa. So the initial validation is really to complete an initial review of all the data and where the data is coming from to certify the pathway, and also includes the site visits. So that's the initial work that's actually going to certify the pathway and take it from an application to like a field pathway code, an established pathway that can be used for reporting. The other component is the ongoing verification services, and that's going to include a field pathway report, which verifies the carbon intensity score, and include the verification report, which is going to verify the data collection and reported and where that's all coming from. And there's also a site visit component. So there is an annual site visit requirement that's part of verification as well. So for those of you that will need verification, you will need to find a verification body to work with at a certain point. So our understanding is CARB is going to have a website that actually has an accredited list of the verification bodies that are able to perform verification services. They've stated a lot of requirements in the regulation for those verification bodies, including staff requirements and training requirements, as well as conflict of interest requirements, and some other steps that they need to make to prove that they're actually able to do that work. So just to highlight two components of that verification body list. First off, there is going to be a training in sometime in the second half of 2019 for the verification bodies. So if they're going to provide those services, they have to complete that training in order to be an official verification body. So that's going to be a big step that they have to complete, because CARB has not set out like a clear timeline for when those training sessions are going to occur. So if they miss this initial one, that might preclude them from offering that. The next the next thing to know is that there will be a mandatory rotation schedule for the verifiers. So at a maximum, a verification body can give services for 6 years and then have 3 years off between offering verification again. So basically, they're not requiring verification bodies to work with somebody for 6 years. They're just setting it up so that the maximum that you could work with a verification body is 6 years. And so after that, there's a minimum of 3 years where you can't offer verification services.
All right, John, so I'm having some pretty specific questions coming in about these verification bodies. Specifically, does EcoEngineers plan to become an approved verification body? And if so, is there a conflict of interest with services offered by EcoEngineers?
Good question. Yes, we're definitely planning to be a verification body. And we actually, that was like the next point is that, we need to do a survey for conflict of interest with all of our clients and potential clients to make sure that we're meeting those requirements. And that's what all the bodies need to do. Specifically, though, there are carve-outs in the LCFS regulation for some of our core services that we offer. So there's not a conflict for QRIN services, for engineering reviews, or for test engagement services. So it's clearly stated in there that we can offer that as well as verification. And for our other services, we are working on completing conflict of interest reviews for them.
And that's something, if you're interested in us being your verification body, we can complete that process for you as well.
Yep, just go ahead and reach out to us, and we can talk more about that.
All right.
Great, thanks, Natasha. So just a couple more points here. The verification body does definitely need to meet those conflict of interest requirements. That's really important that they've done that review, and they should inform their clients about that. So if you are working with one, you need to make sure that they've considered that and meet those requirements. There is also, for the conflict of interest, there's a 5-year look-back period and a 1-year forward period as well. So that means services done this year could impact the ability to offer services in 2020. But 2018 would not influence 2024, 5, and so on. There is, going to be some careful work that needs to be done when assessing the conflict of interest and the services already completed. I do see we have some more questions as well.
Yep, so someone asked if we could repeat those lists of carve-outs. So RFS auditing, so QAP services, engineering reviews, and what was that third one, John?
Test engagements.
Test engagements.
Yep.
Anything else?
Sure. So it's a lot to talk through, honestly. So I'm probably not going to hit all of it, but one other major one that's in several of those conflicts is that if it does not influence the LCFS work, then it does not necessarily constitute a conflict. So it really depends on the type of work that's being done. And the other thing I'd just say on that too, there is a phase-in period for a number of the services as well. So they've specifically identified, for example, that a company that's done LCFS applications can be a verification body, and as long as they address the medium conflict of interest that creates for the first 3 years, and then in 2023 moving forward, that does become a high conflict, so they can no longer offer those services. So there's several, I think like 8 different sections that have a phase-in period like that are special and have that. And just to clarify too, there is a low conflict, a medium conflict, and a high conflict. And the low and the medium can be resolved either with notifying CARB or putting together a mitigation plan to address that. And this is all something that we're working through now and are happy to take questions on.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and forge into the final section here. And we will be taking more questions after we finish out the other updates. So some other updates that are important that we want to make sure everybody's aware of include what we see on the slide. So there's 2 new pathway types that we want to highlight because I think that they offer up a lot of flexibility and new opportunities for people participating in the market. So first up, creation of temporary pathways is not possible under the new regulation. So just as a high-level overview for temporary pathways, they are a lookup table that's included in the regulation that has a conservative CI value, which you can register for 2 calendar quarters. And this is typically used for either new facilities or companies that are trying to enter the California market. So that way they can achieve some value from the fuel they're shipping into the state, even though they don't have their provisional pathway yet. And so this is kind of meant to smooth the process of entering the market and give some value, even though it's not giving full value. So CARB has now put in provisions to allow producers to apply for a new temporary pathway CI value and create a new value literally in the table that's in the regulation. They have specified that it must be a fuel or a feedstock and fuel combination that's not already in the table of the proposed regulation, but that if you're not sure whether you fit into that or not, that's probably a good thing to engage on and look into, because you can use those new temporary pathways for future applications. So a good example for this would be if you're let's say you're a technology provider and you're planning to build 8 facilities in the western U.S. and ship all the fuel to California. You can build the first facility and gather that data, then submit that application to establish your temporary pathway. Then as you build the other 7 facilities, as they're starting up, you can use that new temporary pathway value that you've created in order to begin participating in the market and see that value. So this gives some more options for companies trying to push the edge with technology, or if you're creating a new fuel type that doesn't fit into the table that's existing.
All right, so we have a question here regarding temporary pathways. So what is the process for creating a temporary pathway besides having 3 months of production data?
Good question. So in the regulation, there is not a whole lot of detail about the process. What they've stated is that you need to put together a petition to CARB and submit that. And then you also need to undergo a 45-day public comment period on the pathway before it gets posted and approved. So in our view, this is going to be similar to like a Tier 2 application where you're going to need to put together the data to really justify that new temporary value for that new fuel or feedstock combination in order to establish that pathway. And feel free to reach out to us and we can further talk about that.
All right, and one more question is, while I'm not sure they would grant one at this point, if a temporary fuel pathway is granted in Q4 2018, do we know what happens with that specific CI in Q1 2019?
Right, that's a good question as well. So moving from 2018 to 2019, it says in the regulation that the lookup table values are automatically going to be transitioned from the 2.0 regulation to the 3.0. For temporary pathways specifically, I think that's something that's a little unclear yet, whether they're going to take somebody that has been approved in Q4 and automatically give them that 3.0 value. I think that's a great question for you to reach out to CARB about if you are in that situation. And that's something that we're looking into as well.
All right, John. Thank you.
Yep. So the other new pathway type that we're excited about is the option for design-based pathways. So CARB has now put in provisions that allow you to actually apply for a design-based pathway based off of your design data and what you're planning basically to build or construct. So CARB will review that application with the design data and approve it after it's been posted for public comment. So this will actually give you a public-facing, CARB-approved CI score for what you're intending to construct, which you can use to, show investors or show boards or show any other entity what the potential carbon intensity value is going to be for what you're planning to construct. So in our view, that's very exciting for the new fuel producers and new developers of facilities, because before it was difficult to get some sort of proof for what your facility is going to have for a carbon intensity score before you construct it. But this really gives you a way to get at least an approved design-based score before you construct the facility and give you and your investors more assurance of roughly where your CI score is going to be. Because this is dependent on that design data being accurate. Some other important updates concerning feedstock. There are new definitions in the regulation for animal fat, yellow grease, brown grease, and used cooking oil. So if your facility uses that or you're planning to use that, I would really recommend that you review those definitions in detail and really understand which category you fall into and how you are going to comply with that moving forward. And if your facility, let's say, is mixing a lot of animal fats and used cooking oil, you may need to look at that operation a little more closely to make sure you're meeting those definitions and adhering to that closely. Tied in directly with that is the category now for specified source feedstocks. So specified source feedstocks are feedstocks that will require verification under the provisions in the new regulation. So they're going to be something that has to be verified as well if they're being used as feedstock. And this is mostly because CARB wants to ensure that those super low CI score feedstocks are actually what they are represented to be. I think one of the primary concerns was around used cooking oil and other things that are called wastes. So for that specified source feedstock requirement, there's going to need to be chain of custody documentation and chain of custody requirements and some data from the actual aggregator or production facility where that feedstock's coming from. And also, this can also include joint applicants. So, you can basically meet your requirement from your aggregator suppliers and have them actually submit data to CARB rather than to you. So let me just lay out a scenario with that, because I think it's pretty important for facilities using these feedstocks. So let's say that there's a used cooking oil aggregator that's supplying a biodiesel producer who is also a used cooking oil collector. It may be difficult to get the aggregator to give the biodiesel producer data because the biodiesel producer is also a competitor for used cooking oil collection. So there's an option now for that aggregator to apply as a joint applicant with the biodiesel producer and submit their information to CARB directly rather than to the biodiesel producer. So CARB is able to assess it and to get what they need to for verification, and the biodiesel producer is able to register the pathway with that specified source feedstock together hand in hand, which really will simplify things a lot for reporting and avoid issues with confidential business information as much as possible.
All right, John, we have a question coming in here about verification requirements for feedstock suppliers. Do we know what those entail yet? Are those specific? Are they different from anything we've heard yet?
So, again, it's going to be really around those chain of custody requirements. That's going to be like some of the main requirements really for proving out basically if the supplier says that they're providing 10,000 gallons of this feedstock, and that feedstock is coming from about 1,000 restaurants, they need to know, okay, how much did they collect at those restaurants? Where are those restaurants located?
All right.
Like that kind of detailed information, at least at the front end, to verify what's going on. This is also an area where the different verification bodies are going to have different approaches on this, and CARB may also provide guidance as the program kind of matures and develops and the market figures out how to do this.
All right, John, thank you. Let's move on to those intermediate facilities.
Okay, sounds good. So another piece of the LCFS that's been updated is the inclusion of an intermediate facility component. This is similar to the specified source feedstock component in that if there is a contributing site-specific data for a facility that's tied in with a fuel production facility, that can be applied for as well with the facility's application, and that would be considered an intermediate facility. So let's take that same scenario again to illustrate that first bullet point, the feedstock processing facility using site-specific data. So we have that aggregator again of used cooking oil, and they're using a process that uses less energy. So that biodiesel producer wants to apply with them and draw the boundary basically around both facilities and then get a carbon intensity score. And then they can get a lower carbon intensity score than the default because they use that joint applicant. So in that case, that used cooking oil aggregator would be considered the intermediate facility, and need to submit data and be verified. Another scenario that's listed in the regulation is when RNG is produced and the upgrading facility is separate from the liquefaction facility and the biomethane production locations. The liquefaction facility and those locations that are separate would be considered intermediate facilities as well. And just another thought, the specified source feedstock requirement and the intermediate facility piece as well. These two components kind of provide some relief for facilities that are having trouble under the RFS with biointermediates, because they are able to actually register their approach for additional energy use or chemical treatment at a facility that's outside of their production facility, and they can actually participate in the California program. So this, California is really doing a good job of trying to really open up the market and solve issues that have come up. One last component here for the other updates. Electricity has had a lot of really big developments in the California program. So number one, electricity indirect accounting is going to be allowed within California starting in 2019. Basically, they're going to allow the same sort of book and claim accounting that the RNG system and production uses now, which means that you can put in electricity into the grid in one part of the state, let's say a solar farm in the desert somewhere, and you can put that into the grid and then pull it off to use as transportation fuel in another part of California, like in LA or something. So that's a really significant development, because up to now, California has only allowed a direct connection in order to register the pathway and use it in that manner, unless you're just using the grid electricity. So before, you had to plug in the charging station into the solar panels, but now you can input that renewable electricity into the grid and pull it out elsewhere and do a book and claim accounting for that. So that's a pretty big development. And just a note, that is for the electricity used as transportation fuel, and also electricity used to produce hydrogen that is also transportation fuel. So some pretty exciting developments with that indirect accounting. I think that's a pretty big deal.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Also, there's some other options now to register your electricity pathways. You can register for the lookup table values for just straight grid electricity. You can also now register for something called calculated smart charging. If you look in the regulation, there's literally a table that has the 24 hours of the day and has the actual carbon intensity hour by hour for vehicle charging. So you can actually time your charging to be when there's the most renewable energy production in the market. So if you're able to time it and incentivize employees to charge then, or however you do it, you can get a lot more credits, because, at peak solar production time, there's a lot more renewable energy on the grid. So, so there's several options in there that you can consider if you're looking at electricity vehicles or participating in those kinds of projects. The last piece here is you are still able to register a Tier 2 pathway as well if you have a renewable energy production site and are looking to apply for that as well.
All right, John, it looks like we have a couple of questions coming in, and we're going to address some more of those general questions we received from earlier in the presentation here as well. So to start off, in your best summarization, what is the difference between a design-based pathway and a temporary pathway?
Sure. So design-based pathway is still using facility-specific information to create a carbon intensity score, and it's just based off of design information, where the temporary value is a generic score that CARB has created for that fuel type and is not facility specific at all. You just go to your category of, let's say, soybean oil, renewable diesel, and you get a score. There's nothing specific for your facility. So design is actually still, facility specific, where temporary is just a lookup.
All right, and then another question I saw from a little bit earlier was, what is the change in CI score for RNG of wastewater treatment plant gas that had between 2.0 and 3.0 pathways? Do we have any information on that so far?
That's a really good question. I don't have that information on top of my head, but we'd be happy to discuss that following this meeting. So please reach out to us, because that is a little more complicated to discuss.
All right, and then let's see what else is coming in. So, do you know if CARB restricts booking claim accounting for renewable electricity to bucket 1 RECs only?
So, I think if these are, I think this question is referring to RECs. So, I think basically if you're using the electricity from the renewable production site and you are putting in the grid to use for transportation, you can only really count it in one credit market. You can't get RECs for that solar power and also use it for transportation fuel. I think that'd be double counting. So you do need to make sure you're allocating that correctly in your contract, how it's working, going in versus coming out. If you got more specific questions on that, we could look more at that.
All right, and another question that just came in. On the lookup table for smart charging with electricity, the hour-by-hour multiplier is static, not dynamic, correct? In other words, it is not a real-time table of how much renewables are on the grid, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Thanks for the question, Bill. In that you are going to use that table that's been approved by the regulation that's set. And they calculated that based off of that kind of real data, but they're not going to be changing that table, to my knowledge, going forward.
All right. Those are the questions I'm seeing from right now, John, if you want to get into our LCFS verification-ready.
Yep. I'll just give like another 2 seconds in case somebody is typing one right now. This is your last chance. Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So thank you so much, everybody, for all the great questions today. Got to find the mouse here. So, EcoEngineers has prepared a lot of LCFS verification-ready services, and we're here to help you through this process and the transition into the new regulation. So if you have any questions or want to learn more about that, please do reach out to us, and we're happy to help you with that. A few final thoughts today and takeaways from this, that LCFS regulation is going into effect, and it's been solidified through 2030. So there should be some clear paths to take from this point onwards. The first verification compliance year is 2020, so you're going to need to be prepared for that going forward. And really, from our view, preparation is the key to your success in the new marketplace. So again, please feel free to reach out to us. Kathy's information is here on the slide, as well as her email address. And you can also find all of our contact information on the EcoEngineers website. So thank you so much, again, for joining us and for helping us create new sustainable solutions better tomorrow. Again, thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.